Hello, everyone. Welcome to Trailhead EX 2018. I hope you're all having great time. I see that most of you have got lunch, so nice. So let's get this started. First things first, please do not make any purchasing decisions based on what is shown in this presentation. Please make those decisions based on existing products, documentation, and features. OK, I'm going to talk a little bit about securing your Salesforce orgs. That is what this session is about. A little bit about myself. My name is Krishna Chirumamilla. I'm an associate application security engineer. I work for enterprise security team. So my main job roles and responsibilities are I take care of vendor security. I also take care of apps that we develop internally in Salesforce that are to be used internally. And I also do security reviews on App Exchange apps that we plan to use internally. So those are my job roles and responsibilities. So this is how today's agenda is going to look like. First, I'm going to start a little bit about core security principles. And then I'm going to talk about some fundamental defenses that we are going to use in securing our Salesforce orgs. OK, some core security principles. In the previous days, so to talk about core security principles, OK, before that, I'm going to talk a little bit about org here. So many of you know what a Salesforce org is, right? So a Salesforce org, whenever I say Salesforce org, it is nothing but whenever you log into login.salesforce.com, you see some tabs and everything, right? So that's Salesforce org here. So now back to the security principles. First security principle is defense in depth. To talk about this security principle, I'm going to take the analogy of the castles in the olden days, right? So we used to have castles in olden days, and they used to be like like important part of their administration, governance, and most importantly, they used to home king, right? So any breach into castle would lead to the compromise of kingdom, and then a new kingdom would take the rule, right? So for that, they came up with this technique of building castles with like tall walls. So that is one defensive technique they were using in the previous days. And then they were also using this defensive technique called moats around the walls, right? So for example, tall walls is one defensive technique, and moat is another defensive technique. So they started applying this technique called defense in depth. So you also have to make sure that as an admin of Salesforce org, you apply this defense in depth so that your Salesforce org is secure. All right? So that is one security principle. And then the next security principle is principle of least privilege. So coming back to the castle analogy, so you know that there used to be multiple departments in the kingdoms, right? So for example, there is this soldiers department, and there is this treasury department, right? So in soldiers department, a soldier shouldn't have access to treasury. He should only have access to, I don't know, maybe like weapons making factory, or maybe some what do we call, it's like gladiator style, armed stadium, etc. Right? So that he could practice or whatnot. But he shouldn't have access to treasury and come into treasury department, and he would learn some trade secrets, etc. like that, right? So you have to make sure that you are providing least amount of access that is required for people to do their jobs. That is called principle of least privilege. And you need to apply that when you're doing that when you're securing your Salesforce org, right? So now, since we talked about some core security principles, let's talk about some fundamental defenses and how we can apply the core security principles we learned in the previous section to our Salesforce orgs. So the first thing that we are going to take care of is user and access management. So user and access management is mostly deals with, you have to give like right amount of access to people so that they can carry out their job roles and responsibilities. So user and access management, right? So user and access management can be broken down into 5 layers. The first layer is organization access. So organization access has login IP ranges and two-factor authentication and some other techniques, which we are going to take care of later in the section. But in this section, I'm going to talk about monitoring, which is kind of important but almost often ignored part. So we'll talk about that. Then I'm going to talk about profiles. And then I'm going to talk about sharing rules, right? So monitoring. So for example, think about it this way. People from your company have left to some other company, or they have left to do their own gigs, right? So even after leaving the company, they shouldn't have access to Salesforce. But how do you know they have left the company? Now, this is the time when you have to go to your HR and you have to tell them, like, whenever people leave your company, they have to come back and they have to say, hey, whenever this particular person has left, this person has left, could you revoke the access to Salesforce? They have to tell that to you. So you have to come to an agreement with your HR teams so that they will intimate you that, that particular person has left the company so that you could revoke the access. The next thing is, think about it in another way. So you are using Salesforce in your org, in sales department, but your HR department is not using it. So sales department folk, like for example, Tim is a sales person previously, but he wanted to move to HR department. He moved to HR department. So you're not using Salesforce in HR department, right? So then you have to make sure that Tim doesn't have access once he moved to the HR department. So this also takes a little bit of monitoring on who is moving to where and where you're accessing Salesforce, where you're using Salesforce in your company. So you have to make sure that you are on top of that. And of course, there's this connected apps and API users. Only people who need access should have access, and you need to be continuously monitoring as a diligent admin, right? For example, if you are using single sign-on in your org, Salesforce supports single sign-on, and that is kind of really nice. And if you revoke access at one point, all the accesses have been cut off. Obviously, Salesforce access has also been cut off for employees who have left your org. So that is monitoring part. Here's a quick screenshot on how to freeze your users. So for example, there's this user. You go to setup menu and search for users and get to this user's profile. And if you click on the freeze button over there, the user will lose access. And if you want to deactivate the user, you click the edit button and then click on uncheck the active field over there. You can see active field on the right side to the fourth field is active field, right? So that's how you deactivate users. The next concept is profiles. Profiles is kind of simple concept. So most of the security features are built around profiles. In not just here, even if your iPhone has this concept called profiles. So Salesforce also has this concept called profiles. So before going into profiles, a quick refresher on CRUD FLS. So how many of you know CRUD FLS? Quick show of hands. Awesome. So Salesforce has this concept called objects, fields, and records, right? So objects is nothing but if you want to visualize an object, you can think of a table. So that is object. And here we have like contacts, accounts, opportunities, and leads objects. And in the objects, there are these fields. And in the fields, there are these records, right? So it's kind of simple concept. So this is access to objects is controlled by CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. Access to fields is controlled by field level security, FLS, and access to records is controlled by sharing. So as I mentioned previously, let's get back to the profiles. So the profiles is kind of an important concept. So you have to create profiles in your org for each role. So for example, you have, again, let's get back to the HR and sales analogy example. So you have HR department and you have sales department. In sales department, you have like so many objects, right? So sales object, or I don't know, accounts object, or leads object, etc. And in HR department, you have employees object and you have compensation object maybe. So one of the employees in sales department shouldn't have access to compensation object because this is a confidential information. So you create profiles for HR department and for the sales department, like each separate profile, and you assign these profiles to each users in the department so that these profiles will take care of the security roles that you define. So this is how you set up profiles. You search for profiles in the setup menu, and for this particular profile, you can see that there's only read access to the accounts object, and there's no create access to the accounts object. So when you uncheck the when this particular profile tried to create an object, he wouldn't have access, but he could just read the accounts. So that's how you create the CRUD permissions in profiles. So after that, let's see the sharing rules, which is like record level access. So sharing rules is also kind of an important concept. So I'm going to only talk about org-wide defaults here. So org-wide defaults has like these settings called public and private. So if you give public settings, then any user with access to all the any user with access to that particular object will have access to all the records in that object. So you wouldn't want that always. So some cases, okay, it's okay to have all the record access, but then it wouldn't make sense sometimes. So you have to make sure that this is not the case. So you have to set settings to private most of the times, right? So the next setting is internal and external users. So internal users are the users who are coming into your org through login.salesforce.org or who are logging into your org directly. But external users are users who are coming into your org through external communities, portals, and external chatter users. So they shouldn't have access to the records internally, right? So what you have to do is you have to make sure that those users have private settings set. If you set public, they'll have access to all the records in your org. This makes things difficult, and they'll get access to all the records in your org. So it's like some confidential information is getting leaked to external users, which you don't want, obviously. So sharing settings is also easy. Search for sharing settings, and then click on edit, and then for each profile, for each object, you can set public read write transfer or public read write transfer for internal and external users. Based on these settings, you can define the user and access management. So now user and access management is taken care of. It's like I have described the principle of least privilege in my org, right? So it's easy. So now that my kingdom has like separate roles defined, and I have defined that who has access to what. Now soldier is getting access to what he needs to, and also the treasury department folks are getting access to only the objects that they need to, right? So that's how the principle of least privilege is defined. And after that, so you have been diligently monitoring the users, you have least privilege taken care of, but then what if some of your employees are using very weak passwords? What if their password is just password, right? I need not be like state-of-the-art hacker to get into someone else's account just by guessing password as password, right? So you don't know as admins that whether they're using complex passwords or whether they're rotating their passwords or whether they're using like some security features or not. That's where health check comes in handy. So health check is really nice. You can set like password complexity, and you can also set password history and maximum invalid login attempts, etc. It's not just helpful in defining password fields or password complexity. It also helps you in defining other techniques like HTTPS settings, clickjacking protection, and also like CSRF protection. I don't know if you have heard of cross-site request forgery attacks, but they also can be protected from health check itself. So this is kind of important, right? So health check is very easy to find in your org. Go to your setup menu and search for health check. It will give you a rating. It is based on Salesforce baseline standard. If you define a baseline standard for your own org, you can upload that file onto the org, and then you can search for it. And then you can set the baseline standard. So this is nice. So you can see here, right? Enable clickjack protection for customer visual force pages standard headers, right? So all I have to do is go to the session settings, hyperlink over there, and then change the settings. And the status will be like normal from critical. So that's where health check comes in handy. So now I have taken care of principle of least privilege. Now I have taken care of health check, right? So like the password complexity. Now it's like I've built like tall walls around my castle, so people can't come in easily. But what if some of your employees are using like passwords like the same password across the platforms? So how many of you use the same password across the platforms? I myself use the same password across the platforms. So some people are diligent. They change passwords very frequently, but then some people use the same password across the platforms. So one platform compromising means that other platforms are also compromised. So, and also some employees, they just write their password on stick boards, and then they just paste it somewhere, and it's over, right? So that's where two-factor authentication comes in handy. So in this day and age, many people have been using two-factor authentication, right? So a quick refresher on authentication techniques. Authentication techniques are three ways. That is something you know, that is your password. Something you have, that is your one-time password or authenticator apps token or hardware token. And something you are is your biometrics, right? Your fingerprints or eye scanners or whatnot. So that is two-factor authentication, and Salesforce supports two-factor authentication. So you have to install this app called Authenticator, Salesforce Authenticator. It's available on App Store and Play Store. You can install it. And so setting up two-factor authentication is also easy. So you search for permission sets in the setup menu, and then check the two-factor authentication box over there, and then you assign this permission set to all the profiles in your org. Next time when the users are signing in, they'll be invited to use the two-factor authentication. Now, I've taken care of tall walls around my castle. Now, I built a strong moat around my castle, right? So two-factor authentication is taken care of. Now, what if, for example, your employee has lost their hardware token, or they have lost their, I don't know, their one-time password, and their password is also very weak? There's a chance that their account can be compromised, right? Then I would suggest that you use IP whitelisting. IP whitelisting is nothing but if you are using VPN in your company, so you have some fixed IP ranges. So all you have to say to Salesforce is only let these people from these IP ranges allow into my org. Other people are not allowed. Okay, you are like restricting people who are not inside the IP ranges. And you can also set some granular security level. For example, IP whitelisting here, it can be set to only the login page, and all the subsequent requests can be from any other IP address. And you can also set a granular granular security setting saying, enforce login IP ranges on every request. That makes sure that not just on login, but also on other requests, your IP whitelisting will be enforced, right? So now I have taken care of principle of least privilege, user management. Now I have taken care of password policies. Like I have built like strong walls around my castle, and I have a strong moat with two-factor authentication. And now I have added another moat. I dig a huge hole in front of my castle. So now I also can't go out, which is kind of funny. OK. So that is IP whitelisting. I hope you guys have secured your org. Now that we have secured our org, we are security rock stars, obviously. And so the next steps, I would encourage you all to go home and then set your Salesforce trail logs if you don't have already, and then run health check on that org, and then turn on IP whitelisting if you haven't already, and turn on two-factor authentication and see how Salesforce Authenticator app works, and also develop plan for user and access management, like create some dummy users and see how the user and access management works on Salesforce. It's a really nice concept. And I also encourage you to take these security trails on Trailhead. These are for both admins and developers, which are coming here. So trailhead.salesforce.com, trail security, which is simple. So there's this huge trail. It might take you like 8 hours to 10 hours, but based on your interest, you can finish some trails and you can leave some trails. And also, you have some modules in those trails which are really important. And then I also encourage you to visit trust.salesforce.com to learn more about Salesforce security. All right, thank you. I hope you learned a little bit here. And if you have any questions, I'll be here.